For a minute, I thought you stole Sammy's pen.
I did.
I was like,
Good morning, everybody. We're going to be starting at 10:35. So you've got 5 more minutes. We'll begin at 10:35.
Hey, this is Rich. Is anybody in UB11?
Hey, Rich, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I think we've about got everybody hooked up. I was
Hang
able to
on.
do a lot of them before the other meeting ended, and you got about 31 that are dialed on now, so you should be about set.
Okay. Okay, so we'll begin at 10:35 for the few sites.
I can see your welcome screen, and the recording will start here in just a minute, I think.
It already started.
Oh, did it? Okay, hadn't paid attention. All right. All right, if you need anything, let me know. Talk to you later.
Okay, thanks. shelter training. My name is Susie Silverstein. I'm with the Office of Emergency Preparedness, and I'm just going to begin with a few logistical announcements. First of all, anybody that registered in train by, 5 o'clock yesterday was emailed the slides, as well as 3 additional handouts. We have a form, we have the instructions for the form, and then we also have a page with all the links that are in the presentation. We put them all on one page for you, so you can just download the page, and it's easier to access all those links without having to thumb through all the slides. In terms of questions for today, we're going to ask you all to hold your questions that you ask on the Polycom until the end. But we do have a method set up for you to send your questions during the presentation. If you email them to eprtraining@vdh.virginia.gov, we'll be monitoring that inbox and taking the questions and giving them to the presenters. So if we get a lot of the same question, they'll be able to answer it right away without having to wait to the end. We will continue to monitor that inbox, and as questions come in, even after the presentation, we will get the answers, and then we will post them in an FAQ document that's on the Office of Emergency Preparedness internal webpage. In addition to those slides being emailed out, anybody that registered this morning or hasn't registered yet can find the slides and all the handouts on the VDH webpage. Look up Office of Emergency Preparedness, click the icon for training, and then all 3 shelter trainings that we've done, the material should be right up at the top, and this is one of the 3. So even if you didn't get them, you'll have access to them today. The last logistical thing that I want to mention is evaluations and certificates. We are not taking, we're not taking roll call, or we're not asking for a sign-in sheet. How you verify that you were here is to go back into train, complete the short evaluation, and then your certificate will be available. So how you can do that is you just press the Take Evaluation button. If you don't see it right away, you have to click Mark Completed. There's a little time lag between us ending and that button, the Take Evaluation button coming up. So if you take it quicker than the time in the system, you'll have to press Mark Completed. Then you can do Take Evaluation. And when the evaluation is completed, you can go into My Certificates on Train, and the certificate will be there. We know some people are using these for documentation for whatever continuing education credits that you apply for, and the certificate along with the agenda will usually suffice for that documentation. So now what I want to do is I want to introduce all of the speakers that will be speaking today, and then we'll come up one at a time, and we won't be going back and forth between slides and faces. We'll do the faces all at once so you can see who's presenting, and then we'll just roll through the presentation. So first speaking is going to be Dr. Jabari, the Chief Deputy Commissioner for Public Health and Preparedness.
I'll just share my remarks in a minute.
And then James Moss will be speaking next. He's with the Office of Emergency Preparedness as the State Planning and S&S Coordinator. Then we'll have Julie Henderson for the Office of Environmental Services. She'll be sharing the overall objectives for the course. And then our 3 speakers, we've got Carol Puckett, who's a food safety consultant for VDH. We have Brian Wade with the Office of Drinking Water. He's the Emergency Preparedness and Security Coordinator. And Scott Vogel with the Office of Environmental Health. Okay, so with no further ado, I'm going to pull up the presentation
Let me make my
and let
comments.
Dr. Jabari make comments.
Give me now. Great. Thank you so much, Susie. We just finished an agency Polycom, and I had an opportunity to just tout what I've seen is going to be a phenomenal training opportunity. A lot of great feedback was provided to us based on the training, the basic training that we provided all EDH staff with regards to sheltering. There was the training that was focused on the clinical aspects, coordinated by Janine Uzel and CHS leadership along with OEP, and now today the environmental health training. As many of you know, that emergency preparedness is a passion of mine. It's no coincidence that I applied for this job, and this was an effort. I've been through 6 hurricanes, medical incident commander of 3, have seen various levels of training of staff, of professionalism, of information, of need in these shelters, and I've been a part of a lot of training opportunities. I can tell you this is by far the best I have seen for an environmental health training, so I'm really, really excited to get this rolled out. I want to, certainly acknowledge the expertise that is already out there. There are folks who have been part of the health department and have already been involved at some point in their career in the work that we're going to talk about today. There are folks who just did this last week. This is not just a training that is theoretical, but was actually implemented last week. And I always encourage we to try our best at central office to look at best practices, to look at national standards. A lot of the information coming today is coming via CDC, the experiences that we've had here. But I hope, if time permits, and I want to thank Susie for yielding about a half hour of the original time for this training so we could do the agency Polycom, is for you all out in the field who have done this many a times to give your feedback so we can build upon this training. But really, those are my words. I'm really excited. I want to thank all of you for giving up about an hour and a half of your time. I think it'll be extremely well worth it, and encourage, again, dialogue and participation from the crew. So without further ado, I think we are ready for the presentations. Thank you all.
Okay, here's Julie.
It'll just take a minute for the slides to come up.
Okay, so I'm going to go over our objectives today for the course. So participants will be able to describe the environmental health specialist's role in shelter management for conducting general building assessments, ensuring food safety, protecting potable water supplies, ensuring safe drinking water, including ice, investigating foodborne illness or food-related complaints, ensuring approved wastewater disposal, ensuring adequate and appropriate solid waste disposal, assessing child care facilities if provided by the shelter, and evaluating the sleeping area.
And this is James Moss coming up now.
Hi, good morning, everyone. The next few slides will go over the definitions and a brief introduction to the chain of command and incident command structure. We aren't trying to belabor on these points, but I think it's important to understand the key definitions that are used at the state level that are included in state policy and plans, so that there's a common understanding and operating picture as we move forward. The next few slides will go over the definitions of a shelter. It is a short-term overnight accommodation for individuals threatened or displaced by an emergency or disaster event. At the time of this document, it's important to note that there was no specific state or federal mandates that required services, supplies, or features to be provided within the shelter except for those requirements related to accessibility and non-discrimination, and those are often or almost always covered within the Department of Social Services portions of the planning policies, procedures, and plans. A shelter at a minimum is recommended to provide registration, food services, water, restrooms, climate control, and security. Additional services that could be provided at a shelter but are not limited to health services, reunification, child care, showers, and laundry. Sheltering in general is an action that is taken by an individual to seek protection or refuge when a disaster strikes, and it's an action taken by an agency or organization to provide such refuge. And just for your awareness, this picture here is of the VCU Siegel Center, which was activated for Hurricane Florence last year, almost a year ago exactly, but fortunately it wasn't utilized for response to that hurricane. Next, we'll go over the various types the shelter types that are identified in the state sheltering guidance document that's provided by DSS. It's important to note that this was recently updated in August of this current year, and a lot of these efforts were a direct result of lessons learned from Hurricane Florence. Shelter in place. is to harbor a safe area within a building or structure currently occupied at the time of or during the disaster emergency. What I like to think of as this is if there's a tornado warning that affects your area, is that oftentimes when you go and seek shelter, this is a shelter-in-place effort that's often short-term, and the duration is a few minutes rather than hours or days. Refuge of last resort is a type of mass care facility that is not recommended for shelter, offering only protection or refuge from environmental hazards in the event individuals do not or cannot evacuate.
It's gonna be meeting and like at work and stuff, so like, you know, work's the matter.
Alexandria, I think you have an open line.
My Coke tissue just hatched. Hello. What's up? There's the little thing.
It doesn't want to move.
How do you mean?
You also have an open line. Thank you. And a typical example of a refuge of last resort is a fire station where people assemble or gather for, oftentimes for a tornado type situation. It's not an identified shelter, but it is a known safe location that individuals often assemble at, often before a shelter may be activated or utilized for a no-notice event. Refuge of last resorts do not provide any services or support. They're not intended to function as a place of refuge from the elements until it is safe to return home or evacuate to another location. And this is also not a shelter, as we mentioned before, and is the term shelter of last resort. It will not be used in any state level planning to reduce any confusions. I think this is important to note, especially for the local emergency coordinators. This isn't a term that is used at the state level. You may see it in some of your local plans, but at the state level, you'll have some understanding and guidance on this specific term. General population shelter. This is a facility that provides temporary overnight shelter to all individuals, including those with disabilities or access and functional needs, and non-critical medical care. And medical shelter is a type of facility or portion of a facility that provides sheltering to individuals who require clinical medical care by licensed healthcare professionals. And if you're interested in additional information on that, I would encourage you to go and review the shelter training that was geared towards our public health nurses that was last month. And as I mentioned, we will do a very brief ICS overview. And forgive me for reading my slides, but I'm going to ensure that I'm getting the information correct. After we finish this, if you have if you need additional information or clarification or want to brush up on your ICS skills, I would recommend that you take the FEMA IS Course 700 for additional information. The incident command structure is a standardized on-scene all-hazards incident management approach that allows for the integration of facilities, equipment, personnel, procedures, and communications operating within a common organizational structure. It's important to remember that ICS is flexible and can be used for an incident of any type, scope, or complexity. ICS allows its users to adapt an integrated organizational structure to match the complexities and demands of a single or multiple incident. This is a common wire diagram or organizational chart that you all should be familiar with. The incident commander is going to be that. He's going to have control over the entire incident. For this, it would be the shelter manager. For the overall incident, it would likely be the emergency management coordinator for your specific jurisdiction or locality. The black boxes are the command staff, and the boxes underneath are the general staff. This is often referred to as the FLOP, the Finance and Admin section, Logistics, Operations, and Planning section. The general staff direct and support the activities of the groups and tasks that are under them, which are right here. Important things to note with this is that ICS is designed to be interdisciplinary and organizationally flexible and scalable. The benefits include they meet the needs of the incident of any size or scope, allow personnel from a variety of agencies to meld rapidly and support the incident, provide logistical and administrative support to the operations, is a cost-effective means to provide services. I think when it's important to note that when an incident does occur, an
incident command structure will be put into place. However, when we do go, when a shelter is activated for this example, you will not be reporting to your day-to-day supervisor. In certain situations, or depending on the shelter, you would be reporting to the health and medical director or the shelter manager, depending on if it's a local shelter, a regionally supported shelter, or a state shelter. When you're activated to support shelter activities, you will report to either the shelter manager or the health and medical director, depending on the situation. You likely won't report to your day-to-day supervisor at the shelter. It's important to remember, however, that you can reach back to your regular supervisor and other coworkers. And I call this your toolbox. Reach back into your toolbox for assistance and help. There are resources that are there to help that may not be physically at the shelter with you. Now we'll move on to the roles of environmental health in the shelter.
Good morning. I've worked in shelters for BDH for approximately 30 years, and the one thing I've learned is that pre-planning and preparation is key to our success. That pre-planning and preparation ensures that you have an efficient working shelter for the ICS team, and there are minimal problems that will be a result for the environmental health staff. So what do we do when we're in those shelters? Basically, our roles and responsibilities in an emergency shelter involve emergency and disaster are associated with the following areas. We will be addressing the safety and health of the building environment itself, safety and health of the shelter occupants, safe food and water. We will be interested in providing proper waste management and disposal and effective vector and pest management. All of these areas are interconnected. For instance, our food safety is predicated on whether or not we have a potable water supply in order to clean our equipment and utensils and to actually cook our food. Our waste management will also be impacted by the breeding and behavior of certain pests or any kind of vectors within the facility itself. So we have a lot of areas to cover. They're all interdependent, depending on what our role is at that particular time in the shelter itself. To assist us with evaluating those particular areas, the CDC has developed an environmental health assessment form for shelters. The original CDC form covered 14 different areas of environmental health, and the main purpose of it was to assist environmental health practitioners in conducting rapid assessments of shelter conditions during emergencies and any kind of disaster situations. We've edited the form for our EH roles in Virginia shelters themselves, and you'll note that in the upper left-hand corner there is the VDH logo, and we've added the title VDH Environmental Health Assessment for these shelters. The form itself is then provided by CDC with an instruction sheet to be used with it to actually show you how to actively be involved with the actual form itself. The tool is an assessment form, and we have taken the actual instruction sheet and adapted it to fit with the VDH environmental form where we have made our changes. These two forms were available today for you to download, and they're also available in the Emergency Response Mass Care Plan, Annex H, under the health and medical sections themselves. Both of the forms should be downloaded for today's training itself. So let's see how we actually use this form to actually do our assessment while we're actually in the shelters. So starting with the column 1, we are actually looking at our assessing agency data. Who are you doing the work for? Who are you? And basically, what is the contact information in case somebody wants to get in touch with you? There's also a box on the right-hand corner basically that states immediate needs are identified, yes or no. That box will be used once you actually perform your assessment of the sheet itself in order to determine later on if you need to take some kind of intervention or corrective action. Under number 2 on your form that you will be looking at, it's going to actually identify the facility type, name, and the census data. So basically, what type of shelter are we dealing with? Is it an American Red Cross facility? We want to know the date the shelter opened, the date we're actually doing our assessment, and the actual time of our assessment. We will also look at the reasons for our assessment. Is it pre-operational? Is it initial? Or is it an actual routine assessment? Another could potentially be if you should happen to see the complaint or if it's a follow-up inspection for a previous inspection that you may have done. There's also information here with reference to the location and a description and any contact information for that particular shelter, and also what the facility type of the shelter itself is. And then finally, we're going to look at the actual census data on the form itself. Basically, how many people were there at the time when you're doing the assessment, the estimated capacity of the actual shelter, the number of residents that typically will be there permanently for the length of time that the shelter is open, and then the number of staff or volunteers. This particular information can be obtained usually from your shelter manager at the time when you're making your assessment. We're going to skip down through your form. We're going to move past 3 through 10 because we're going to go back later on and actually evaluate that criteria more in depth. But I want you to drop down to the section that's labeled number 11, comments. This is a section in which you will actually put your notes as you're doing your assessment. It may be an area where you might record your temperatures if you're doing a food inspection. It could be that I want to actually make a note with reference to the source of my water that's going to be available. Or I may even make notes about what kind of sewage disposal I'm going to be dealing with. Am I on a public water system, or may I be using bladders? So basically it's an area just for you to make notes about any of the columns 3 through 10 as you're doing your assessment. Our next sheet that I want to talk about will be the section 12 of the actual assessment sheet. This is the immediate needs sheet. This is probably one of the most important aspects of your sheet in that you're going to note here any observations that you may have noted of which you have concerns, and they should correspond with a respective number on the actual assessment sheet itself. So now our shelter opens, and what do? We're going to explore your columns 3 through 10, starting with the column that's labeled facility, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the facilities itself. Here's an actual picture of a facility that was in Williamsburg last year during the hurricane situation that had involved there. And these are the actual areas of assessment that are on your assessment sheet. And we're going to talk a little bit about these particular criteria. One of the things that I will mention initially is that a lot of these things should have been evaluated during your pre-planning, and that initially as an EHS, when I arrive in the actual shelter, I'm probably going to be able to assume that a lot of these have been taken care of, but don't ignore them. And later on, when you're actually doing subsequent inspections, you want to make sure that you check these things out, because things could change, especially when you're dealing with a disaster or an emergency situation. So let's look at each one of these. The structural damage. First, I want to look at the facility itself and see if there's been any physical structural damage to the facility. I want to look at security law enforcement available. Are there police officers or security people on staff? Or do I have a shelter check-in system? I want to look at my water systems. Are they operational? Do I have an improved water supply? Is hot water available? Then I look at my HVA system. Is it operational in terms of basically, do I have heat? Do I have air conditioning? And if an emergency situation does arrive, do I feel like I'm in a good position if the power goes out? I want to look at adequate ventilation in the system itself. Is the facility well ventilated, and are I free of any kind of air hazards such as fumes or potentially smoke in the facility itself? Then I'll look at my adequate space per person. Now this will depend upon the classification of the shelter itself. If it is an evacuation shelter, I want to ensure that I have 20 square feet of area per person. In most cases, this is what we will be dealing with unless you happen to be involved in a general shelter where you probably have a permanent facility such as maybe a homeless facility. And in that case, you want to make sure that you're getting 40 square feet per person. And then finally, we have a classification of a special needs shelter. That special needs shelter usually would want to require between 60 and 100 square feet per person. And basically that is so that you can accommodate any of their equipment that they may need to address their special need. For instance, like wheelchairs, or they may have oxygen tanks or other type of equipment that they may need. And you may even have a combination in one shelter where you'll have an area that's for special needs and you'll have an area that's for general population. And one of the things I have learned is try not to put the special needs people on a second floor, because what happens if the power goes out, they just do not have access like they should. I want to make sure that my facility is free of injury and occupational hazards. For example, make sure there aren't any exposed or frayed electrical wires, no carbon monoxide hazards, no unnecessary hazards, and I want to make sure that I'm keeping my stairwells and my hallways free of any kind of clutter, which sometimes can be difficult dealing with lots of people coming in from outside and bringing all their personal possessions. I want to make sure that my facility is free of pest and vector issues. I should note the presence of any kind of mosquitoes, fleas, flies, roaches, or rodents and try to address that situation accordingly. And there should be an acceptable level of cleanliness within the facility itself. That's pretty self-explanatory. With reference to the electrical grid systems being operational, basically, when I walk in the facility, are the lights on and do my personal devices work that I need electricity for? Is there any evidence of any kind of electrical overload while you're doing your assessment? And in most instances, I've never actually been in a shelter where I did not have generators. So generators typically for a shelter where you may be involved in a disaster situation will be equipped with a generator, and you want to look at the generator location, make sure it has sufficient capacity, that you have adequate fuel and adequate ventilation of that particular generator. Now, it could be solar, it could be gas, it could be diesel, and while we are not experts probably in dealing with generators, you can always consult with your information or your incident safety officer or the shelter manager themselves in terms of the fact that these things should have been addressed initially before you ever even open the shelter. And then finally, the indoor temperature. You want to randomly select a location in the facility, figure out the temperature in the air is, or you can simply look at a thermostat to record the temperature of the thermostat itself. Now, on the instruction sheet, it does mention that the ASCE standard for temperatures in buildings should be assessed. And the information that I recently got that in Virginia, in these shelters, you're looking primarily for temperatures between 65 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Basically, is it comfortable to those residents that are going to probably spend a significant amount of their time and they don't really want to be there? So let's do a knowledge check. Which of the following areas are EH responsibilities? We have food, water, laundry, mass vaccination, wastewater, solid waste, traffic and parking, crowd management, shelter layout, and security. Let y'all think about it for a few minutes. But basically, even looking at your assessment sheet, the answer that you should have come up with is that the food, water, laundry, wastewater, and solid waste are what you're primarily going to be responsible for. So now let's move on to, there's just a slide here with reference, again, as a reminder that if you have any questions, to please email those to the address that's on this slide itself. So periodically throughout the training, we're going to be flashing this up for you. Now let's look at section 3 of our assessment form, and it basically involves the shelter food itself. This particular shelter was at the Williamsburg shelter last year. Disasters are often followed by hunger. One of our earliest response tasks as the shelter is to ensure you have sufficient food and that it's safe to eat. Various food safety methods can be utilized. Primarily, you want to make sure you have an approved source of your food, that you don't have any types of spoilage or contamination of the food itself. You want to look at your food equipment, make sure that's protected from contamination. Are good hygienic practices being used? If cooking is occurring on the site, are they cooking animal foods to the proper temperature? And then finally, are they meeting temperature and time requirements for critical control points, which can be identified as cold holding, hot holding, cooling, and any type of reheating. Basically, what I've been talking about are those FDA factors and interventions that EHS is employed every day in the routine risk-based inspections that they do. So your job will still be the same regardless, although you may have some challenges along the way. There are some special considerations required for mass feeding operations. One is that you're trying to feed large numbers of responders and the affected public. So there may be more risk involved with the mass feeding that you are trying to conduct. They also may be managed by non-government organizations such as the American Red Cross, or you may have vendors coming in from outside your state. And that can be challenging in that you're dealing with people potentially that have not been approved in terms of the layouts of their facilities, and you may not have developed working relationships with them like you would, for instance, when you're preparing in a fixed or permanent facility. The advantages of those fixed or permanent facilities, too, is that they're already authorized by the VDH, and they also are capable of serving large numbers of people. On the other hand, you may run into mobile kitchens. Mobile kitchens have advantages in that they're flexible for moving, and they also bring with them their own utilities. So they may have generators, bottled water, or bladders for actually capturing their waste. So either or, whichever is preferable for the actual managers of the shelter, but we want to ensure that the food is procured, stored, handled, prepared, and served safely along the way. In these mass feeding operations, it is recommended, if possible, that you do a pre-operational assessment. And here we have those things that we want to consider in that assessment. You want to know 24/7 who your management contact information is so that you can contact them if you happen to run into some problems during your assessment. We want to know what type of food operation it is. Is it fixed, permanent, or does it happen to be a mobile kitchen? I want to look at their mass feeding plan. I want to look at their menu items. Are they actually providing food that are low-risk foods that are one-day service, or are they actually trying to do complex food operations? Then I want to look at approved food suppliers, and I'm probably going to mention this several times throughout the presentation today because, I mean, it's very much one of the primary things that you want to look at when you're actually doing your assessment of the shelter itself. So discuss possible safety and health risks with management at these sites when you're going through these particular items with them. We also want to look at pre-preparation, service, and disposal. Because it's pre-operational, you're not going to actually see them in operation. What you're probably going to look at is their standard operating procedures and see if they're in line with the Virginia food regulations. We want to look at our food preparation schedule so that we are doing our assessments during times when they're actually preparing food, and we want to know exactly when, where, and how it's occurring. We'll look at food safety training of the management and staff volunteers. We may get so lucky as to have a food vendor who is a certified food protection manager and all his staff has been trained in specific food safety techniques. On the other hand, you may also have volunteers that are going to be good Samaritans and try to help you out in that shelter, and if that's the case, you may consider having a small food handlers class for them prior to the actual opening of the facility. And then I want to look to ensure that I have safe, approved water source. Look at your sewage disposal. If they're on public water and sewer in these particular, then you're fine. But with my sewage disposal, they may be actually bringing bladders with them, and they have to be emptied at some point. So how are they going to empty those? Look at your solid waste disposal. Do I have trash can facilities throughout the shelter itself? And where am I going to take that garbage and trash to? And how frequently is it going to be picked up? Look at your vector control pest management practices and any plans they have for disrupted utilities. In some instances, the mobile kitchen itself probably already has addressed that, but what are you going to do in a permanent facility and talk to them about how they can handle that? Can they change their menus, limit their menus, and can they flow with different instances that are happening during the actual emergency or disaster? And then finally, we'll look at personal hygiene. Do they have hand washing facilities, not only for the food service operations, but also for the patrons as they go through your food lines? You want to look to see if they are using gloves appropriately for ready-to-eat foods. So what are our food safety goals in that shelter? We want to reduce the risk of foodborne illness. We want to intervene and ensure that corrective action is taken when the food safety may be compromised. We want to work with the food operator to provide safe, sound, and honestly presented food. And we want to educate the public volunteers that food safety is important before, during, and after any kind of emergency or disaster. Now we get to what equipment and methods are we going to use for ensuring that food safety. A question comes up, well, who's going to actually be doing this? Is it a food program, standardized environmental health specialist, or is it whoever I can get due to the fact that I do have limited manpower resources? Best practice is for standardized environmental health specialists, but in instances where that cannot happen, it'd be advisable if you do have the availability for them to consult with a district standardization officer or a food or a food supervisor. So this is equipment they will need to be arriving with, and this equipment should be in good working order for them to conduct those food safety activities. They need an approved food temperature measuring device. This is not optional. How else are they going to be able to evaluate your critical control points? They should have approved alcohol swabs, sanitizer measurement devices such as test kits for chlorine, quaternary ammonium, and iodine. And temperature strips are optional. Typically, as EHSs don't use these, but they can be available. You need a flashlight, disposable gloves, hand washing reminder signs, inspection forms, and educational brochures as per your district policy. And you may want to have a camera. Again, this particular piece of equipment is optional. So let's look at what we're actually going to assess while we're in the shelter itself. We want to ensure that all the food is prepared on the site, that it's served on the site. We want to look at safe food sources. Again, approved sources. Hopefully some kind of contractual agreement has been prepared in advance, and that the supplier that they have chosen is inspected by a regulatory authority. In no instances should food that's donated from the public be received. There have been a lot of foodborne illnesses that have been associated with donated food that was given to emergency workers or the affected public, so please don't go there. We want to have an adequate supply of food. You will depend initially on the number of days that's projected for the event, but usually there again is some kind of contractual agreement with the food vendor for backup supplies, and in some scenarios you may even contact the state EOC to determine if you're running out of food or if you need some other kind of resource to help the food vendor. We want to look at appropriate storage. Of course, any kind of temperature, time for safety food should be stored in refrigeration. Your other food supplies should be stored in areas that are safe, easily cleanable, and typically at least 6 inches off the floor. Basically refer to your Virginia food regulations and the FDA food code for the actual storage of those particular food items. We want to make sure we have appropriate temperatures. This would involve not only your cooking, but your cold holding, hot holding, cooling, and your reheating of any kind of time and temperature for safety foods. Your hand washing facilities need to be available. We have soap, water, if you're lucky, hot and cold water under pressure, but a portable facility may be used if it's operational. You want to have some kind of hand washing signage, and you want to ensure, again, that it's for both the food service staff and for patrons that are visiting their facility. I want to look at my safe food handling as per my Virginia food regulations and FDA code. Again, keep in mind your risk factors and your interventions that have been identified by the FDA. Dishwashing facilities should be available. We want to make sure we can wash, rinse, and sanitize all of our food equipment and our utensils. And then finally, the kitchen area itself should be clean. So now let's check again. True or false? In general, shelters must discard donations of cooked food from the public and not serve them to shelter residents because the food preparation method and standards of outside sources are unknown. True or false? The answer is true. We don't want to receive any kind of donated food from the public. Sometimes that's hard to do because people want to help you, and we just can't allow that to happen because of the consequences that could occur. Now I want y'all to jump on your assessment form to the section 6 involving the shelter health and medical. Basically, the environmental health specialist's task or role is to respond to foodborne illness complaints and reported outbreaks or any kind of unusual food-related injuries. Work should be done effectively with your nurses and epidemiologists, and you should perform environmental assessments during those foodborne illness outbreaks. One of the things you can do here to actually assess this area would be to interview the food vendor himself to find out whether or not he has any reports or any kind of complaints. You could check with your incident safety officer during those visits. And if, for instance, the Virginia Department of Agriculture actually establishes shelters for animals, then you will also want to be checking to make sure there are no exposures that are occurring in those shelters for those animals or any kind of animal disease transmission to humans. So again, if you have any questions, please refer them to this website. The last thing I want to mention with reference to food and foodborne illness and such, remember that these facilities are essentially temporary food events. You do not want to create a disaster on top of a disaster by trying to close a facility. You want to make sure that you work with the operator, help him be successful, and then your job will be a lot easier along the way. So I'm going to turn the presentation now over to Brian, and he's going to talk to you about drinking water and ice.
Good morning. So what we're going to be looking at next within shelter operations is drinking water. This drinking water will not only affect what people are consuming, it also affects hand washing, ice, and wastewater. So on your checklist, you're going to see, you're going to be looking for an adequate water supply, an adequate ice supply, a safe water source, and a safe ice source. So the Office of Drinking Water puts out water advisories to assist you in understanding if the water source in that particular shelter is safe. There are multiple types of advisories that will affect these different areas. So these are the three types of advisories issued for a water event. We have boil water advisories, do not drink notices, and do not use notices. The boil water advisory essentially comes down to do not drink tap water without boiling it first. This also applies to food preparation and ice making. So if a facility has an automatic ice maker and there is a boil water advisory in effect, that ice maker cannot be used because the water essentially is contaminated that's being used to make the ice. At this point, we recommend using bagged ice, either brought in by a third-party vendor or picked up at a local store or facility. This also goes for food preparation. So if you have a vendor there that is making food, ensure they're either using bottled water to do that or that they are boiling the water first prior to using it for any type of food prep. So the boiling kills the bacteria and other organisms in the water. This is the preferred method. We do not recommend using bleach or any of those other methods to purify water. Part of the reason for that is with the new high efficiency washer and dryers that are out there, there are more additives in bleach now. It's not 100% pure as it used to be. So there is additional concerns using that method. Boiling is the preferred method during this type of advisory. So when properly boiling the water, you're going to bring it to a rolling boil. So you're not just going to see little bubbles. You want to make sure that the water is boiling. You can let it boil for 1 minute and then use it once it's cooled. For food preparation, as long as they let it boil for 1 minute, it doesn't necessarily have to be cooled. That's just for personal use. Also with the boil water advisory, people washing hands at sinks and other things, that's another concern. So boil water needs to be used for hand washing as well, not just for food prep and other items. So a do not drink notice is what it says. Do not use the water for drinking, making ice, brushing teeth, washing dishes, or preparing food. Hopefully the shelter will not be open in an area where there is a do not drink advisory. Part of the reason is this also will affect hand washing as well as any other type of water utility or water infrastructure that is accessible for drinking water. So any faucets that are in the facility, along with water fountains and ice makers and anything along those lines, cannot be used during a do not drink notice because of the risk of people consuming water from a faucet and getting sick. For a do not use notice, this means water should not be used in any circumstance. Should not be used for brushing teeth, dishes, clothes, food preparation, toilet flushing, bathing, showering, for essentially everything. Bottled water needs to be used for all functions at that particular location. Our advice with most counties is during a do not use notice is not to open a shelter in that location where that advisory is in effect, as the risk for contamination to the public and to other pieces of infrastructure within the facility is extremely high, depending on what the situation is and how the water is affected. So for a do not use notice, it means it cannot be used for anything, and this does include waste disposal for bathrooms and anything else. And then for additional information, you can go to our emergency preparedness section on the drinking water website with VDH. We have additional information there on all of these advisories. And you can also go to the CDC website with their healthy water section. They have more information as well. All right, next I'm going to turn it over to Scott for shelter sanitation.
All right, good morning. I am Scott Vogel. I'm currently the private well program coordinator. I've been with the health department since about 2001. I've worn various hats, but I'm going to focus on sanitation for this next part of the presentation. Information. So when we talk about sanitation for the shelter, going back to the checklist here, we're looking at laundry services, toilets, showers, hand washing, and then down towards the bottom, I'll go into a little bit about the cleanliness in shelters. So just as kind of a review, what's the primary job as an environmental health specialist in a shelter? Like, what's the main reason we're there? Of course, we're looking at preventing communicable diseases from being spread, and also looking at the environmental hazards and the vectors, keeping vectors out of the facility and controlling for that. And then again, as we've talked about earlier in the presentation, this is not a regulatory process here. We're advisors, and you're there to use your environmental health skills to make these shelters really work. You're a partner in this whole thing. All right. Laundry. So the best way to look at this, I don't think many people typically inspect laundry machines at a facility, but the best way to think about this is just it's a giant dishwasher. Kind of the same principles involved with this. One of the key thing up front is to make sure there's no cross-contamination between what's dirty and what's clean. You want to have a specific storage area between, storage area for clean stuff, storage area for dirty things. There's got to be some kind of system in place for that, just like with dishes. Make sure that the people that are doing the laundry have access to gloves, and then wash, rinse, sanitize. You guys all do this all the time. Make sure that there's a wash and a rinse cycle, and then the key thing is the sanitization for 160 degrees for 30 minutes, or you can use the bleach sanitizers for per the manufacturer's recommendations. Laundry is going to be more for longer term facilities. We talked at the very beginning of this presentation that not all facility shelter types will have laundry as part of the operation. And of course, one of the easiest things to do is to hire out a private contractor and have them handle on the industrial scale how to do the washing of the laundry and stuff. So this is just a generic picture of some kind of laundry service going on here. I don't think it's specific to shelters, but just to give you kind of an idea, there might be a process here, but it looks like this process is overloaded. So, you know, a giant pile of laundries just looks kind of chaotic to me. You've got to have your clean stuff somewhere. You've got to have your dirty stuff somewhere. You don't want to put dirty clothes where the clean clothes is supposed to go, because that could contaminate things later. You know, we're talking about, especially if there's a medical facility involved with the shelter, you could definitely spread some diseases and things around. And then, of course, this person's sticking his arms into the laundry, so I don't know if he's contaminating himself or the laundry, depending on whether it's clean or dirty. So, you know, again, just best practices, gloves would be a good thing here, and being able to handle, having adequate capacity to handle the laundry at the facility. Moving on to toilets, pretty standard things we're always looking at in the on-site program in particular. Of course, it's best practice to have an actual bathroom and running water in toilet facilities, but commercial privies are, you can utilize those, and if you don't have enough fixtures, you can always call in more of the commercial privies if you need them. There should be pre-planning in place to be able to call in additional facilities if they're needed. For toilets, we're looking at 1 per 20 in general, definitely 1 per 20 for females. You can kind of, just like in the Marina program, you can kind of cheat it a little bit with, if you have urinals on the male facilities, you can fit, more people per fixture. You have to have some allowance for ADA compliance, and best practice would be to have those ADA toilets and things available, where in the shelter you might have some people with medical problems and things like that. Facilities should be separated, men's and women's. And of course, probably the key consideration is that they should be well stocked with toilet paper, and they should be clean. When you're looking at the actual commercial privies, you definitely want to think about location. You obviously don't want them right next to your food prep facilities. You want them separate. Having them out in the direct sunlight is going to, you don't want to have people going into these things and it's like 120 degrees in the bathrooms. You want to think about these things when they're being located. So this was going to be my segue into talking about showers. This again, with laundry, is more for long-term shelters, but this picture I was just going to say, if you're this close to people, the longer you're in this situation, the more important showers become. You want to be clean, right? And you don't want to smell dirty feet when you're sleeping. But what I'm going to use this slide now is to drive the point home that you guys have the ability, you have the knowledge and the skills to look at this picture, and I bet you, I'm rusty and I saw 2 things wrong with this picture, and you guys might be able to see it as well. So I'll let you look at it for a second, and the first thing is the separation distances here. You should have 2.5 to 3 feet between the cots, and if you have families and they come to the facility and they push things together, this would be okay. If this was afterwards and people were they want to keep their family in one spot, but this is definitely not good because you don't want strangers to be have to be too close to each other. And plus, from the vector aspect, you need that space between human beings. The other thing, too, is going back to the principles you use every day. That floor surface is, I don't know if you can see it in the picture out there, but that's basically just blue tarp that's protecting the gymnasium floor here. So thinking about things being durable and cleanable, and then also vectors. This is difficult to sweep, it's difficult to mop, difficult to keep clean, and if you've got 100 people traipsing over it constantly, it could come up pretty easily. Before you know it, there's piles of tarp everywhere. Going back to showers, sorry. You have one bathing facility. You should have one bathing facility per 15 people, and again, separated between men and women. Hand washing facilities. This is definitely one of the critical things to look at. You need to have the ability for people to wash their hands, to continuously wash their hands, and it should be convenient. Of course, the best scenario would be to have adequate sinks, but if not, then you could always call in more and more of these the little hand washing stations like you see at festivals and things. You flip operate the water, wash your hands, soak them down, and wipe them off, and then sanitize at the very end. Wash, rinse, sanitize. Again, 1 per 15 people. Of course, hot water is what we wish for. If you can't have hot water, then, of course, water is great. Worst case scenario, if, this is a event that's taxed all the services and stuff, at least sanitizer available so people can, at the very least, sanitize their hands. And then this is, again, a great spot to use your educational materials, put your hand washing signs all over the facility as much as you want to. I'm sure nobody would mind. So again, the facilities are only as good as the cleanliness. They need to be serviced daily at least. I mean, they need to be serviced as often as they need to be serviced, really. And then dumpsters need to be serviced at least every 3 days to keep the critters from being there. Hopefully not bears, but definitely all the rats and flies and all that stuff. That's like a disaster on top of a disaster there. To talk about the sanitation, the general cleaning of the facility, this is often overlooked, but first off, a lot of times the facilities are cleaned as if they are the facilities they were previously, like a school is cleaned like it's a school. Well, this has to be hyper cleaning in these situations because you've got a lot more people over a lot longer period in a small area. So they definitely need to be cleaned more often and wash, rinse, sanitize. Another thing to overlook very easily is, you've got a bunch of volunteers or something, and it's immediately assumed that cleaning, there's not much skill involved, but there is. There's a right way to mop and there's a wrong way to mop. It's very important that staff are trained on how to properly clean and deal with spills, different spills, sharps, biohazardous chemical spills, that there's some sort of spill kits or processes in place. And then, of course, they do need to use the proper disinfectants and concentrations, and the methods have to be appropriate for the cleaning. And then also they should have access to masks, gloves, whatever they need for the particular cleaning that they're doing. You don't want your cleaning staff to get sick, while they're doing the cleaning. I'll prevent that. It's good to have the bodily fluids guidance on hand. I've got the link down here at the bottom of the page. I'll just touch on it pretty quickly. But, particularly if there's an outbreak or something on top of, the disaster, or the outbreak is the disaster, you want to make sure that bodily fluids are handled appropriately per the CDC guidance. You need a mask, gloves, a gown to protect, you don't want to get the spills on your clothing or anything, goggles to protect from splatters in your eyes. The first step is to clear everybody out of that area where the spill has occurred, just in case if there's any kind of aerosol or anything in there while you're doing the cleaning. And you need to have the bleach with a 1 to 10 ratio of 5% bleach to water. And that bleach, if you're using bleach for the sanitization, you don't want to use hot water because hot water can kill just the effectiveness of the bleach. That's something, going back to the people that do a lot of cleaning crews, they try to use the hottest water as possible to actually clean the facilities, but if they're using bleach, that's going to degrade the effectiveness of that bleach. The first, again, wash, rinse, sanitize. A lot of you deal with this all the time and you know about it. So the first step is to remove any of that organic material using absorbent material, or like some sort of paper towels, things like that, things that are going to soak up as much of that organic material as possible so that you're kind of washing down that surface. Then you can mop over top of it, washing and rinsing the surface. Then, of course, the last step is to go back over the surface the last time, and hopefully everything's removed, and that's the sanitization step. Just looking at the overall inspection process, you do want to keep in mind whether you're trying to do a rapid inspection versus a long, comprehensive inspection. Of course, it's best to at least do a comprehensive inspection, at the beginning. But with the understanding that there might be a widespread event and there could be other shelters that you need to get to, so be thinking about the more critical points that you need to look at. Consider the length of the operation, the scope of the event, the type of operation and disaster that you're dealing with, and then the timing of the inspection. Just like in restaurants, if you want to look at the way they're prepping the food, you want to be there when they're prepping the food, not at 12 o'clock at night when everybody's sleeping. On the other hand, if you want to look at how they're maintaining and cleaning the facility, 12 o'clock at night is that's when a lot of times they're actually doing a lot of the heavy cleaning and stuff, because everybody's sleeping and they can get access to a lot of the facilities. And again, for review, this is not regulatory, so you want to try to correct things while you're out there, discuss things with the managers so that they can hopefully help you and put some things in place, address the issues. And then you can always use your skills to come up with solutions and things. Like if there's not enough hand washing stations and you can't get, for some reason, those little hand washing stations in there, coolers are fine, just like for temporary food events and things. You can set up some coolers and elevate them and wash your hands while you hopefully have access to that water that's falling out of the cooler. You've got a captive audience in the shelter, so it's a great time to give them your educational materials. Post your signs again about washing your hands and how important it is. And if you've got the materials for how to address these disasters, it's great, to have them available to people, shelter staff, or the people that are in the shelter, so they know when they do return to their homes, there's things for them to think about, like of course, I'm the well guy, I got to talk about wells. So, there's information on what to do if your well's been flooded, and some resources for that. So, what is the number one most effective way to prevent the spread of disease in a shelter? What do you think about that for a minute?
Hand washing.
Thank you. I heard it here. Hand washing. True or false, the number of brick and mortar fixtures, just generally the number of toilets or even commercial privies and things in a shelter, determine the number of people that it can serve. This harkens back. Oh, well, I'll let you think about that for a second. So I put these pictures up here because this is the alternative. You're not shutting down this facility because they don't have the proper number of fixtures. So the answer in general, it's false. You want to serve as many people as you can. You want to get them out of the immediate disaster threat, and then hopefully, if you do have a shortage, you can address that later on when it's safe and you have the supply chains coming back online and everything going as planned. True or false, to clean up bodily fluids, add 1 cup of bleach to 1 gallon of hot water and mop up the fluids. So this is pitfalls, the trick question, because there's a lot of things wrong with that statement. I think the old guidance was 1 gallon, or 1 cup per 1 gallon of hot water, or water, sorry. What's wrong here is the hot water and the ratio. And then even the process, you want to try to remove as much as you can with the absorbent materials first, then wash it down, and then sanitize it at the end. So I'm going to talk quickly about solid waste. Well, waste in general for a facility. Of course, you've got your dumpsters on the left-hand side here. You've got trash containers. You've got your sharps boxes, medical waste. Very important to make sure there's adequate collection facilities at these places. It should be one 30-gallon trash can per 10 staff residents, and they should be distributed evenly throughout the facility. It's a vector thing, and it's, at the end of the shelter, when the shelter closes and things, if there's not adequate trash, there will be trash everywhere. It's just one of those things that happens. If you've got trash there, trash facilities that are adequately spread out, then people will be more apt to throw their garbage and things away right away. There should be appropriate separation between your solids and your hazardous wastes and your medical wastes, and then appropriate disposal, such as the sharps boxes. You want to make sure that needles and things like that are going into a sharps box so nobody's injured while they're handling trash. Then the timely removal factor, making sure that trash is going out to the dumpsters and leaving the facility as quickly as possible, so you're not having dumpsters that are overflowing and trash going everywhere, just setting up problems with flies and rats and all that stuff. And bears. You go back to the other side. Knowledge check again. So which of the following are critical components of shelter assessment tools? So all of them are. All of these are critical things to look at and think about in the facility. And use your skills as an environmental health specialist. If you're new, you'll develop them. If you've been around for a long time, then you've got those skills in place, and just use them. You know how to look at these situations. You know how to think about bacteria spreading and stuff like that. Math question. To accommodate 1,000 residents, and if you've got your sheets handy, this will help you. What are the number of bathroom fixtures, hand washing fixtures, showers, and I will leave laundry off there because laundry just has to be adequate for the facility. So bathroom, hand washing, shower facilities. That's a lot of, if you think about it, that's a lot of fixtures and a lot of hand washing facilities, but it's important. If people are in a small area, they're confined, they're in there for long periods of time, so it's very important to have these things in place. Bathroom facilities, again, in general, it's 1 per 20. Hand washing and showers, 1 per 15. Child care facilities are going to be more critical in longer term shelters, shelters that are going to be there for a long time while housing is recovering, where people are going to be, they may start returning to their jobs, so they're going to need child care facilities. This is again using the same skills you use for everything else. We're looking at those critical points and making sure they've got adequate procedures for the diaper changing facilities, and they're washing, cleaning, and sanitizing those facilities regularly. They've got the hand washing available. They're using toys that are, first of all, safe, and second of all, they're toys that can be easily washed and sanitized in like a bucket of sanitizer. The actual food and bottle preparation areas are clean, washable, sanitized areas, and general cleanliness. And then you can just refer to the actual this ratio. This gives you all the ratios for the different ages for daycares. All right, section 10, looking at sleeping areas. In general, it's 20 square feet per person. So the one on the right definitely has great spacing, and that floor is very cleanable and very durable. There are actually coverings that you can put on gymnasium floors that protect the gymnasium floor that are cleanable, washable, and removable. Carpeting's not a great idea because they're obviously not very cleanable if there's some sort of like bodily fluid spill or something. But overall, again, we're not shutting down the facility. We're just there to try to make things work out. The best spacing is it's 2.5 to 3 feet foot of spacing. If you do 2.5 feet for the spacing, you don't quite get that 20 square feet. But if you do 3 feet, you're fine. That gives you the adequate spacing you need. And again, if you get the families that come in and start occupying these areas, they might pull some of those things together. I mean, that's not a big deal as long as they still have that overall footprint that they have to use. There should be adequate numbers of cots, beds, and mats. Of course, mats are way down on the list of recommendations. It's best for people to be off the ground on cots and beds. Adequate supply for bedding. Bedding is changed regularly. The longer you're there, the more that's going to be a critical factor for environmental health. The adequate spacing and the level of cleanliness for that area. I think that wraps up most of our discussion. Turn it over to questions now. They're not all directed for me, it's for everybody.
Did you get any questions? No questions?
No, we haven't received any questions so far, but we'll open up the floor if anybody has any. We've got our presenters here that can take questions.
Hi, this is Jessica in Hampton. I just have a couple of questions or need clarification. One, the shelter training we're getting today, is this specific for state-run shelters or any shelter that we may be contacted to do an assessment of, like of our local shelters when they open? That's my first question.
Hey, Jazz.
Hey.
The information that we provided today is for shelters in general, can be applied at all the different types of shelters that you may be confronted with. It may be easier when you're in a permanent shelter to provide the best practice as opposed to a shelter that is involved in an emergency or a disaster situation. Did that answer your question?
Thank you, Carol. Yes, don't go anywhere because this one's for you too.
Okay.
When talking about approved food sources, I just want to clarify that the non-government organizations such as Red Cross and Salvation Army, those don't typically fall under VDH regulatory authority, but they would be approved to provide food service in this type of situation.
Okay, remember that this is not a regulatory inspection. It is an assessment of the food service, and we want to work with the operator to get them as best in compliance as we can and to make sure they're serving safe food. The situation may also arise that a waiver is provided because you're in a state of emergency. And if that's the case, then say for instance, the requirement for a VDH permit would probably be thrown out the window at that point. We are in consultation with the AG's office at this time to resolve those issues, to make sure that legally we are doing what's appropriate, and we will get back to you with a specific answer in terms of whether a permit actually has to be issued.
Oh, okay. Thank you. And then my last question is just regarding this assessment form. We leave this form with the incident commander or shelter manager. Is that correct? Are we scanning it?
Yeah, we also discussed that while we were having our meetings for the planning of this training. You want to make sure you have a copy, and most of us don't carry old-fashioned mimeograph paper, and it's not in 3-part triplicate. So what you probably will do is you'll keep your original and ask the shelter manager to make copies for them. And of course, at some point during your visit, you want to go over your assessment, especially if you found some immediate needs that needed to be addressed, so that they can work with you to resolve those situations.
Okay. I was just wondering because there's no signature slot, but we would just have them sign like on the form, anywhere on the form.
It's because it's not a regulatory inspection, it's just an assessment of the facility itself. That's why we didn't ask for any signatures or anything. And the actual format of the form is what was recommended by CDC.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Great questions. Does anybody have any other questions?
All right. I do. This is Brian Pierce with Chesterfield Health District. I actually have 2 questions. During the initial portion of James's, he went over the 4 types of shelters. He said that was updated recently, right? Well, in these wonderful sheets that you provided, the types of shelters that James went over are not actually the same as the ones on the sheet. Are y'all going to update this sheet so that we can see the square footage correlation and how it translates to the types that James talked about?
Come on up, see. James is coming up.
My old Chesterfield crew. So I got my teeth on public health. Hey, Jack. To answer your question, we wanted to get the plan out prior to Dorian hitting, knowing that there were still some things in flux in regards to the plan itself. The plan as it stood last week was posted on the internal website, and we'll be updating that in the weeks to come or days to come to reflect some of the changes that have been going on. And just for everyone's awareness, the Department of Social Services at the state level has been doing planning in conjunction with what we've been doing independent of what we've been doing at VDH, and we're trying to align all those various pieces and parcels of plans as it relates to the state level efforts, to the regional efforts, to the local efforts, and to the district efforts. So that's why some things haven't caught up to in the plan thus far. But thanks for the question.
Excellent. And then our second question is, during the facility assessment, we notice on this sheet, it doesn't actually state anything about checking for smoke or carbon monoxide detectors. We were wondering if that's something that's going to be provided, if it needs to be added on here or anything along those lines. Especially considering the generators, the presence of the generators.
It's actually addressed on the instruction sheet under 32 under the facility, and those were just some of the recommended things that you would look for. And there'll be other people in the facility yourself, especially if you're dealing with a local shelter. You'll have fire people there, you'll have building inspectors there. So if in doubt, or if you don't feel like you're the expert in that particular area of the facility review, then go ahead and use some of those local government people that are what we consider the experts in the field. Did that answer your question?
Not specifically. I'm actually thinking more along the presence of smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors. Like fire safety requires there to be smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors in habitated places, buildings, facilities. So even though some of these shelters are pop-up, they're probably still, according to fire code, required to have smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors. Now you talk about safety in regards to planning for all of those different things, and generators is actually on 38 and 34 as well, but none of them talk about the actual safety protocols in regards to the smoke detectors for pre-warning or carbon monoxide detectors for the safety of the public that will be in the shelters.
And probably a lot of that is because most times the pre-selection of the shelter itself already has those facilities in that particular. Most of the shelters I've dealt with have already been approved buildings by those local authorities. So it may be something that we need to address with future training as to how you would address those problems.
And Brian, to answer your question a little further, I think this goes back to the planning elements of that. And in those planning efforts, when you're identifying those facilities, to ensure, and this isn't incumbent upon you, but it would be a good idea to have the fire marshal there. But in these planning meetings, when you're going out to assessing these facilities, pre-event, to have the fire marshal there so you can address those issues with them. I know when we were in Chesterfield, that's something that we did when we started looking at the facilities, and Rich is shaking his head. So yeah, I mean, that's the importance of the pre-planning that goes into this, so you're not dealing with these issues in the middle of people coming in trying to get out of storm's wrath.
In a lot of these facility issues too, I'll be honest with you, when I was working in local shelters, they were already determined and had been assessed by those local government officials that were there to assist us. So we're basically there as an EHS to verify that those situations have been taken care of. They're not our area of expertise.
This is CJ in Chesapeake. Our annex talks about our rabies control, but there was no mention of animals. So if there's a separate animal shelter, what is our role there? And then if you're in a shelter where they are allowing animals, pets, especially if it's a service animal, what role do we have?
When we briefly touched on the health and medical piece of the assessment form, I mentioned that the Virginia Department of Agriculture is responsible for those animal shelters, and that we as an EHS just might want to have a relationship with VDACs while you're actually there in the shelter to determine if any kind of exposures are, being reported or developed there while you're there for a visit. Did that answer your question?
Not really. I remember you talking about the VDACs aspect, but one of our roles in the main manual is for the rabies portion. So are we supposed to be checking for rabies vaccine verification and not, or inspecting these facilities? Is done by VDACs? But if it's a pet shelter, our local animal services did the last, just during Dorian, they did everything there. But I'm not 100% clear on what our role is.
Because this is kind of an evolving area in our planning for shelters, most of the responsibility has put with Department of Agriculture, but in your daily work role, we are responsible for investigation of any kind of exposure. So I would think that you would be working closely with them, and maybe we need to actually honestly look at what VDACS is actually doing in terms of control of those animal shelters.
Okay, thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions? Okay, I do want to remind you that we will keep that inbox open, so if you think of any afterwards, you can go ahead and send them. Before you all get up and leave, Julie's just got some closing remarks.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone for attending today, and thank you for your questions after this training. We will be, since this is our first one, we will be looking at how we can improve it. Consider also placing it online for people to take at will. And so any input that you have from us is much appreciated, and thanks for your time today, and everyone have a good weekend.
Hey, Adrenia, this is Rich. Are you guys done?
Yes, we are.
Okay, thank you.